I am going to introduce you to literally every person who has ever been a part of the United States Congress. Between his business acumen and his father dying from an infected wound and leaving him a large inheritance, Morris was quite successful. Lee Resolution, the 38-year-old merchant and former sea captain. Hey, old Crazy Eyes is back. How many senators were on time? No quorum! Oh boy. That can't be good. William Grayson of Virginia didn't show up at all. Of course, he's dead, so I guess that's a valid excuse, and I am not about to dig into it. Why do we even have a constitution? It started on... Oh, what the... God damn. March 4th, 1797, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The 5th United States Congress kicks off with a one-day special session, the purpose of which is to inaugurate a brand new president. That's right, for the first time since this whole thing started, someone other than George Washington is going to be in charge. Introducing the new boss man, John Adams.
I know him.
When the 4th Congress ended yesterday, we had 32 senators. 21 of them were not up for re-election. Of the remaining 11, all but 2 were re-elected. Aaron Burr will be replaced by a former senator, and William Koch will be replaced by no one. And then by William Koch. I'll explain in a bit. The point is, we have no brand new guys to start this one. So that means we've got nothing but returning senators to get reacquainted with. And considering just how long it's been since I made the last episode of this series, that's probably a good thing. So, for the special session on March 4th, 1797, we've got 27 of our 32 senators present, so we'll start with them. And in an effort to keep this section entertaining, I've prepared some interesting and new fun facts for each of these guys. So here we go. Samuel Livermore of New Hampshire has been in Congress since the beginning. He was a representative for the first 4 years and then defeated Payne Wingate to join the Senate in 1793. In 1876, Charles and Daniel Saunders incorporated a new town in New Hampshire and they called it Livermore, after Samuel Livermore. Daniel's wife was Livermore's granddaughter. It was a boom town, and like many boom towns before and after, it eventually went bust. It's an unincorporated ghost town now, but according to the 2020 census, it did report a population of 2. So shout out to the 2 people living in Livermore, New Hampshire. Make sure to like and subscribe. John Langdon of New Hampshire is an original senator, and in fact, he was one of the 8 who were on time to the very first session on March 4th, 1789. He was re-elected in 1794. His new fun fact is also about having a town named after him, but there's a twist. Normally, I'll tell you when someone is the namesake of a town in the Goodbye Forever sections of these videos, because generally those towns are named posthumously. But not this one. Langdon, New Hampshire was incorporated in 1787, and it was named after John Langdon because he had just finished up a term as governor, which was called president at the time, and he had just been elected to a second term as governor for the following year as well. Benjamin Goodhue of Massachusetts has also been in Congress since the beginning. He was a representative in the first 4 Congresses, and then he was specially elected to the Senate last year to replace George Cabot. That term was due to end coming into this Congress, so on the same day as the special election, the Massachusetts legislature also elected him to a new 6-year term, which starts today. I don't really have a new fun fact for him, but I do want to draw your attention to his portrait. So, over the last few episodes, we've had some fun laughing at some of these guys' portraits. Theodore Foster, I'm looking at you. But I've given this one a pass until now. Look at that face. He looks like Lord Farquaad. Also, check out the uncropped version. Something about that pose, like, yeah, check this out. Makes me laugh every time. Theodore Sedgwick of Massachusetts is just like Benjamin Goodhue. He started in the House all the way back at the beginning and was specially elected to the Senate last year to replace Caleb Strong. The only difference is that the term he stepped into still has 2 more years on it, so Sedgwick won't have to face re-election until the end of this Congress. My new fun fact for him is a little long, but bear with me. So, in the town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, a few years before the Revolutionary War, there was an enslaved woman by the name of Mum Bet. She and several others were owned by a Colonel Ashley. Ashley was a prominent citizen, and in 1773 he served on a committee that wrote something called the Sheffield Resolve, basically a formal public protest against the British. And it included the following line: "Mankind in a state of nature are equal, free, and independent of each other, and have a right to the undisturbed enjoyment of their lives, their liberty, and property." Sounds familiar, right? This Sheffield resolve got pretty popular. People 240 years later might say it went viral, and the everyone is equal and free sentiment ended up being a part of the Massachusetts state constitution in 1780. Back at the home of Colonel Ashley, Mum Bet heard them talking about it, and she said to herself, "Hey, I'm a person, so that should include me." Along with another enslaved person from the Ashley household, a man called Brom, they went in search of a lawyer who would be willing to take their case and sue for their freedom. Enter Theodore Sedgwick. According to the Constitution Center, there had been about 30 prior cases of an enslaved person suing for their freedom, but Brom and Bet v. Ashley was the first time someone did so on constitutional grounds. Sedgwick argued that based on the language used in the Massachusetts Constitution, slavery in Massachusetts was illegal. The court agreed and ruled in favor of the now former slaves. As you might imagine, Colonel Ashley disagreed, and he appealed. And so a year later, in August of 1781, Sedgwick argued the case to the County Court of Common Pleas, and the jury agreed with him. Brom and Mum Bet were free. Now, I don't know what Brom went on to do, but in the case of Mum Bet, she changed her name to Elizabeth Freeman and went to work in the Sedgwick household as a paid worker. She remained close with the family for decades, even after buying her own home and starting her own family. And when she ultimately died in 1829, she was buried in the Sedgwick family plot. Theodore Sedgwick. Cool guy. Theodore Foster of Rhode Island. Ah, old crazy eyes. He is another original senator. He joined the first Congress late after Rhode Island finally ratified the Constitution. He got the short term and had to be re-elected right away in 1791, and he was re-elected again coming into this Congress, making him the first senator to be elected 3 times. His brother is Massachusetts Representative Dwight Foster. But here's the new fun fact. Like many of these guys, Theodore Foster has a town named after him. But like John Langdon a minute ago, Foster's town already existed before he joined Congress. It even predated Langdon's town. Foster, Rhode Island was incorporated in 1781. I like to think that any time Theodore Foster or John Langdon needed to settle a disagreement with other senators, they would just look around and be like, "Hey, anyone who has a town named after them, raise their hands." Thought so. James Hillhouse of Connecticut was a representative in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Congresses and was specially elected to the Senate last year to replace Oliver Ellsworth. Like Theodore Foster, Hillhouse was just re-elected, so he's starting a new term. During the Revolutionary War, he had been a captain in a unit called the Governor's Foot Guard. No, they did not guard the governor's feet. The name meant that they served on foot, alongside the Governor's Horse Guard, who did not guard the governor's horses, but rather were cavalry units. Both units still exist today, by the way, as part of the Connecticut militia. It's a largely ceremonial thing, but hey, technically they could be called up to active service if necessary. Uriah Tracy of Connecticut was a representative for the 3rd and 4th Congresses, and he too was specially elected to the Senate last year. You remember, all the resignations between sessions? Anyway, he replaced Jonathan Trumbull Jr. I couldn't find a ton of new info for him, but I do have this. When he was 20 years old in 1775, his militia unit in Roxbury, Connecticut was among the very first to respond to the skirmishes at Lexington and Concord. Isaac Ticknor of Vermont was new to Congress last year when he was specially elected to replace Moses Robinson. He had made a run for the House back in 1791, but he finished 3rd behind Israel Smith and Matthew Lyon. According to the Biographical Directory of the United States Congress, Ticknor was an agent from the state to the Continental Congress to present Vermont's claim for admission into the Union 1782 to 1789. I choose to interpret that literally. Like, every year from 1782 to 1789, Ticknor would show up uninvited to the first day of the Continental Congress and ask if Vermont could join, and every time they said no, and Ticknor would just turn around and go home. Elijah Payne of Vermont joined at the start of the last Congress, succeeding Stephen R. Bradley. After Vermont presumably finally got tired of sending Isaac Ticknor to the Continental Congress for no reason, they agreed to settle their border dispute with New York, which was the primary hang-up in their quest for statehood. Vermont and New York each named 3 commissioners to work together and negotiate an official border and settle the various land claims between New York, Vermont, and New Hampshire. Elijah Payne was one of Vermont's commissioners. John Lawrence of New York was a representative in the 1st and 2nd Congresses, then went away for a while, and then came back last year when he was specially elected to replace Rufus King. Before and between his time in Congress, while Lawrence was a practicing lawyer, many students studied under him to learn the law. One of them was Charles Adams, son of the then Vice President John Adams. Charles seemed to be on track for the same success his brother John Quincy would eventually achieve, but unfortunately Charles cracked under the pressure of being an Adams and became an alcoholic who quickly drank himself to death in 1800. I realize now that that didn't really have anything to do with John Lawrence. Oh well, let's just move on. Richard Stockton of New Jersey is one of the newest senators, having just been specially elected last year to replace Frederick Frelinghuysen. At 32, Stockton was the youngest senator in the 4th Congress, and, at least for now, he's the youngest senator in this Congress as well. As for his new fun fact, I got nothing. See, Richard Stockton's father was also called Richard Stockton, and that guy was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, so he is everywhere. Every time I could find this Richard Stockton, it's just standard resume stuff. Kind of boring. Well, according to the New Jersey Historical Society, this Richard Stockton was called the Duke, so there's that. James Ross of Pennsylvania joined the Senate back in 1794 during the 3rd Congress. He was specially elected to replace Albert Gallatin, who had been disqualified a couple months earlier. In the 1780s, after Ross graduated from college, he first worked as a teacher at Washington County College, which was later chartered as Washington Academy, which eventually merged with nearby Jefferson College, thereby becoming Washington and Jefferson College, which I've never heard of, but it's apparently still around today. In fact, it was one of 2 Pennsylvania colleges to serve as a filming location for a Netflix series called The Chair, which I've also never heard of. I don't get out much. William Bingham of Pennsylvania joined the Senate at the beginning of the last Congress in 1795, succeeding Robert Morris. While the Revolutionary War chapter for the lives of most of these guys consists of served under so-and-so or fought in the Battle of such and such, Bingham's Revolutionary War resume is a little different. In 1776, the Second Continental Congress sent Bingham to the island of Martinique in the West Indies to set up shop as a merchant, and also make contact with the French and maybe see if he could get them to join up in this little struggle over here. He did not get the French on board while he was there, but he did manage to capture some British ships, and when he returned to Pennsylvania in 1777, he brought with him a whole ton of guns and ammunition. You might even say, a boatload. I'm sorry, I'll see myself out.
Brother, this guy stinks!
Henry Latimer of Delaware has had a wild ride. He narrowly lost election to the 3rd Congress to John Patton, but then successfully challenged the election and joined the House in 1794. A year later, he moved up to the Senate after being specially elected to replace George Reed, who had resigned his seat all the way back in 1793. In that special election, the man Latimer defeated by 1 vote was John Dickinson, a founding father and older brother of Senator Philemon Dickinson. By the way, Latimer attended medical school in Edinburgh in Scotland. That's not an interesting new fun fact, it's just that in a previous video that city came up and I'm a dumb American, so I said Edinburgh. And I needed to redeem myself. John Vining of Delaware has been in Congress since the beginning, serving first as Delaware's one and only representative in the 1st and 2nd Congresses. He was elected to the Senate heading into the 3rd Congress, succeeding Richard Bassett. After his parents died when he was 11, Vining was raised by Caesar Rodney, who would go on to be a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Later, when Vining pursued a career in law, he studied under another Declaration signer, the aforementioned Senator George Reed. John Eager Howard of Maryland is another one of the many guys who joined the Senate by being specially elected last year between sessions to replace Richard Potts. Well, they weren't all elected to replace Richard Potts, I just mean they were all specially elected last year. You know what I mean. Anyway, like Benjamin Goodhue of Massachusetts, Howard stepped into a term that was ending right away, and so on the same day as his special election, the legislature also elected him to a new 6-year term. Back in 1795, while Howard was still a member of the Maryland State Senate, he had actually declined an offer from his presidential doppelganger to serve as Secretary of War. John Henry of Maryland is another original senator. He started in 1789 and he was re-elected in 1795. In the presidential election coming into this Congress, Henry actually received 2 votes for president, when 2 of Maryland's electors cast their second votes for him instead of the Federalists' official second choice, Thomas Pinckney. Stevens T. Mason of Virginia first joined the Senate back in the 4th Congress after he was specially elected to replace James Monroe. He had actually been elected the previous November during the 3rd Congress, but didn't show up until June of 1795. You remember, I did a whole skit about it? Also, speaking of previous episodes, you'll recall that in the last House episode, we met Thompson J. Skinner and Mark Thompson, and I said I didn't like how their names were spelled. And if you've been wondering this whole time, yes, I do hate the way his name is spelled. You know, if I had a nickel for every time in this episode that I encountered the name Thompson spelled without a P, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't a lot of money, but it's weird that it happened twice. Well, get me another nickel, because the T in Stevens T. Mason stands for Thompson, without a P. Man, so now I've encountered that goofy-ass spelling as a first, middle, and last name. Weird. Henry Tazewell of Virginia was specially elected back in the 3rd Congress to replace John Taylor. In fact, he and Stevens Thompson Mason were elected on the same day. But unlike Mason, who took his sweet time and didn't arrive until the 4th Congress started, Tazewell actually went to Philadelphia right away, joining the 3rd Congress just over a month after his election. Now, I really like the name Tazewell, but I was listening to an audiobook recently and the narrator pronounced it Tazwell, so it's possible, probable even, that I've been saying it wrong, but I like Tazewell better, and this is my show, so I'm going to stick with that. If I'm wrong, yell at me in the comments. John Brown of Kentucky has been in Congress since the beginning, representing 2 different states, the first congressman to do so. He was a representative from Virginia in the 1st and 2nd Congresses, then was forced to resign when Kentucky split off from Virginia and became its own state in 1792, eliminating Brown's district. This was fine for Brown, though. He was immediately elected one of Kentucky's first senators. Here's the new fun fact for him. He is, at the age of 39, still a bachelor at this point. He will finally get married near the end of this Congress in 1799 at the age of 41. I know that's not a big deal or anything, but it is super unusual for this era. Humphrey Marshall of Kentucky joined the Senate at the start of the last Congress, succeeding John Edwards. Back in 1788, when he had been running for election to be a delegate to Virginia's state convention to ratify the Constitution, Marshall made an enemy of a man called Jordan Harris. Making enemies was nothing new to Marshall. He was a Federalist and he was super duper anti-religious in a land full of anti-Federalists and super duper religious people. But his feud with Harris took on a more personal note, and the two ended up exchanging open letters in the newspapers. Eventually, this culminated in a physical confrontation in the middle of a street in Lexington, Kentucky. From an 1892 biography by Anderson Quisenberry, Mr. Harris resolved to give him a caning and did actually assault him with 2 pistols, both of which he fired at Mr. Marshall, who then boarded him with a stick, belaboring him so lustily that he precipitately left the field. Alexander Martin of North Carolina has been in the Senate since the beginning of the 3rd Congress, winning a crowded election to succeed Samuel Johnston. Back in 1770, while Martin was working as a lawyer and justice of the peace in Salisbury, something called the Regulator movement happened. The long and short of it is that a bunch of Western farmer types, the Regulators, rebelled against the economic policies of the Eastern coastal elites, merchants, lawyers, government officials, etc., and so forth. Most of those economic policies benefited the Eastern upper class, while at best doing nothing for the Western agricultural class, and at worst actively harming them. And so, one day in September of 1770, Martin was in Hillsborough in his capacity as Justice of the Peace when a mob of regulators stormed the courthouse and whipped and beat pretty much anyone they could get their hands on, including Martin. But despite that, when a similar incident seemed to be on the verge of unfolding in Salisbury the following March, Martin and a few others went directly to the regulator camp to negotiate a deal with them, and successfully prevented a repeat of the Hillsborough incident. Unfortunately, British Royal Governor William Tryon completely ignored the deal and crushed the regulators anyway at the Battle of Alamance a couple of months later. Timothy Bloodworth of North Carolina first joined Congress as a representative in 1790, but then lost his bid for re-election. He overcame a crowded field to win election to the Senate at the start of the last Congress to succeed Benjamin Hawkins. Back in the 1780s, Bloodworth had been elected to the Continental Congress, but later resigned. In 1789, when the new Constitution was sent to North Carolina for ratification, he did everything he could to fight it, including serving as a delegate to both state conventions, Hillsborough and Fayetteville, to argue against ratification. This effort almost succeeded in the sense that it did delay North Carolina's ratification, but ultimately it failed and North Carolina ratified the Constitution in 1790. So it is kind of funny that Bloodworth was immediately elected as one of their first representatives under the new Constitution. William Blount joined the Senate last year as one of Tennessee's first senators after it became a state. He had been governor of the Southwest Territory from its inception in 1790 up until it stopped existing upon statehood, and he wanted to be governor of the new state of Tennessee as well, but he knew he would lose to the ultra-popular John Sevier. Get used to him, he's got a lot of cameos in this episode. So Blount settled for election to the Senate instead. Back in 1790, shortly after being appointed territorial governor by President Washington, Blount negotiated the Treaty of Holston with the Cherokee, which, among other things, established some official borders of the new Southwest Territory. One of the things Blount then had to do was choose a territorial capital. He picked the settlement where they signed the treaty, and he named it Knoxville after Secretary of War Henry Knox. Jacob Reed of South Carolina joined the Senate at the beginning of the last Congress. He defeated then Representative John Hunter to replace the retiring Ralph Izard. Reed, no relation to former Delaware Senator George Reed, had an eventful Revolutionary War period. He was studying law in London when the war started, and in 1776 he returned to South Carolina to join the fight, quickly becoming a militia captain. After the British captured Charleston in 1780, Reed was taken prisoner and exiled to St. Augustine in Spanish Florida, where he was imprisoned at St. Mark's Castle until being released in a prisoner exchange in July of 1781. At one point during his imprisonment, Reed actually spent 12 days in solitary confinement due to some imprudent expressions in his letters. Josiah Tatnall of Georgia joined the Senate last year after being specially elected to replace George Walton, who had just been a temporary appointment to replace James Jackson. Tatnall was born at Bonaventure, the family's plantation in Savannah, which included a small family graveyard, which was the style at the time. Over the next couple hundred years, that graveyard grew and grew and grew and became the Bonaventure Cemetery, which is today the largest municipal cemetery in the city of Savannah. It was also prominently featured in the book and movie Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil. Additional fun fact, that book is the only book I have ever quit reading partway through because it was just so boring. James Gunn of Georgia is another original senator, joining in 1789 and being re-elected in 1794. Back in 1789, during the first Congress, President Washington had nominated a man called Benjamin Fishburne to a federal office. He had named a bunch of people to a bunch of jobs since they were filling out a whole new government, and all of his previous nominations had been quickly confirmed by the Senate. So when this one was rejected, Washington was confused and pissed. Washington was so pissed, he actually went to the Senate chamber and demanded an explanation. Senator Gunn told Washington that he had objected to Fishburne's nomination. The oversimplified backstory there is that James Gunn hated General Nathanael Greene. Benjamin Fishburne had once sided with Greene in a dispute over a horse many years earlier, and James Gunn was really good at holding a grudge. But the backstory doesn't really matter though. What does matter is that Senator Gunn stood up to President Washington and flat out told him that he wasn't required to explain himself. Washington was known for not losing his temper very often, but when he did, it was something. This must have been one of those times, but tragically, his specific response to Senator Gunn wasn't recorded, other than that he showed great want of temper. At any rate, this set a precedent for how presidential nominations would be made to the Senate and how they would be confirmed or rejected, with neither side having to provide explanations to the other. And with that, we have our first 27 senators. As for the 5 empty seats, Tennessee's is actually legitimately vacant. William Cox's term ended yesterday, March 3rd, 1797, with the end of the 4th Congress, and since the state legislature failed to elect a senator during their winter session, Cox had to go home when the Congress adjourned. It'll be up to Tennessee Governor and former Congressman John Sevier to appoint a temporary replacement to serve until the legislature convenes again in September. New York's empty seat is the one that changed hands in this election cycle, and the guy who won it, former Senator Philip Schuyler, simply hasn't made it to Philadelphia yet. No big deal, it's just a one-day special session. Lots of new guys skipped those back in the early days. And as for Rhode Island, New Jersey, and South Carolina, their incumbents, William Bradford, John Rutherford, and John Hunter respectively, are simply missing, which seems a little strange since the previous Congress just ended yesterday. At this point, I would assume that they just left the last Congress early, which isn't unusual. However, looking at the Senate Journal for March 3rd, William Bradford and John Rutherford were both here. John Hunter's last appearance in a vote was on February 21st, so he probably did just dip out early, but Bradford and Rutherford were literally just here yesterday. But for whatever reason, they didn't want to stick around one extra day for this special session. With the new president inaugurated and the re-elected senators sworn in, the special session ended and Congress adjourned until the constitutionally prescribed first Monday in December. May 15th, 1797, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first day of the first session of the 5th United States Congress. Why so early? Well, I'm sure the senators were asking themselves that very question. Only 18 of the 32 were there on time, and considering how early of a start date this is, I'm surprised we have that many. But it is enough for a quorum, so let's get into it. Right out of the gate, President Adams explained the early start in a letter. It's a super long letter, and Adams occasionally refers to himself in the third person for some reason, but the basic point is that he called them into work early for two reasons. The first was that the new executive directory of France was being an asshole, and Congress needed to figure out what to do about it. The second was that, in case no one had noticed, there's a big old ocean next to us which we rely on for commerce and trade, and maybe it would be a good idea to establish a military department to protect ourselves on the water. Like an army, but, with boats. Adams wanted a navy is what I'm saying, and he needed Congress to make it happen. Neither of those issues could wait until December, hence the early start. So here we are on May 15th, and one of the on-time senators is the new Tennessee senator, appointed by Governor John Sevier to temporarily fill the vacant seat formerly held by William Koch. And that new senator is William Koch. Sevier either really liked William Koch, or he was just lazy and said, send that guy back. William Koch had first joined the Senate as one of Tennessee's first senators alongside William Blount on December 6, 1796. Both men had tried to join back in June of 1796 when Tennessee officially became a state, but Congress rejected them on the grounds that the state legislature that had elected them was not, at the time, an official state legislature. So Koch and Blount had to go back to Tennessee, get elected again, and then go back to Washington to join the Senate. New fun fact for him, Koch was a big supporter of the State of Franklin movement, the push to make a small western part of North Carolina its own state in 1784. They established a local government and everything. John Sevier was its president/governor, and William Koch was elected as its delegate to the Continental Congress, should the state of Franklin be accepted. As I sincerely hope you already know, that never happened, and the area went back to being part of North Carolina, and then part of the Southwest Territory, and finally part of Tennessee. William Bradford has been a senator since the start of the Third Congress, so he's entering his final 2 years now. He is also, at 67 years old, the oldest senator for this Congress. Back in 1775, Bradford was living in Bristol and serving as Rhode Island's deputy governor. On October 7th, the British ship HMS Rose bombarded the town. Bradford boarded the ship and met with the captain, successfully negotiating a ceasefire. This was a pretty impressive display of magnanimity, considering that Bradford's home was among those destroyed. Soon after, Bradford was elected to represent Rhode Island at the Second Continental Congress in 1776. But he had an awful lot to deal with at home, what with his wife's death and his literal home needing to be rebuilt, so he never attended, which means he missed out on signing the Declaration of Independence. Poor guy. As for John Hunter, he is the newest senator. He just joined a few months ago in January of 1797 after being specially elected to replace Pierce Butler. I have no new fun fact for him for this section, but I do have a mistake to acknowledge. So I've been using this picture for him, but this isn't John Hunter. Well, it is John Hunter, just not our John Hunter. This is a British surgeon who died in 1793. Quick peek behind the curtain here. When somebody's Wikipedia page doesn't have a picture of them, I'll do a cursory Google image search just to see if I can find something that maybe somehow the Wikipedia editors missed. I've found a lot of portraits this way. And yes, before you ask, I do my best to investigate and make sure that the portrait matches the person I'm looking for. So with that said, I honestly don't know how I ended up using this incorrect portrait. So I apologize for my mistake. Forgiveness, please. On May 22nd, 1797, only a week late, John Rutherford of New Jersey arrived. Rutherford first joined the Senate at the beginning of the Second Congress when he succeeded Jonathan Elmer. He was just re-elected coming into this Congress, so he's starting a new 6-year term. I couldn't find much for new information about him, but his father, Walter, was apparently a founder of the St. Andrew's Society of the State of New York, which still exists today. So, there's that. So now the only empty seat is the one from New York. Philip Schuyler still hasn't arrived yet, but I'm sure he'll be here soon. For now, though, there's business to attend to. Appointments to confirm or deny, legislation to debate, treason to uncover. Wait, what was that last one? July 3rd, 1797, the Senate receives an incoming message from the big giant head. Apparently, a letter landed on his desk that appeared to be written by Senator William Blount of Tennessee, and it was not great. Now, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail here because this whole thing deserves a video of its own, but here is an extremely abridged version of the Blount conspiracy. During his time as governor of the Southwest Territory, Blount and a couple business partners were major land speculators in the far west, buying up a metric shit ton of land. At the time, the area that would later become the Louisiana Territory belonged to Spain. But in 1795, after France won a 2-year war with Spain, Americans started to worry that France would gain control of Louisiana and cut off American access to the Mississippi River. So, the market for all these western lands collapsed, and Blount and his partners were suddenly on the brink of financial ruin. To remedy this potential disaster, Blount concocted the following plan. He would recruit British assistance, then a combination of American militias, friendly native tribes, and British Navy ships would attack a number of areas in Spanish Louisiana and Florida. Then, after they were victorious, the British would get control of the region. Since they were a stronger ally to America at the time, they would allow the Americans continued free access to the Mississippi. This would therefore drive the prices of Blount's western lands back up, saving him from the financial ruin he feared. His downfall came when one of the conspirators, a man called James Carey, got cold feet about the whole thing. In April of 1797, Blount sent him a letter about the plan and closed it by saying, "When you have read this letter over 3 times, then burn it." But Carey didn't burn it. Instead, he turned it over to the government, and it made its way up the chain until it landed on the desk of President Adams. Adams sent the letter to both houses of Congress on July 3rd. Vice President Jefferson introduced the letter to the Senate while Blount was out for a walk, and so as soon as Blount got back, he read the letter again. I would love to go back in time just to see Blount's reaction as he heard his own letter being read aloud. Jefferson asked Blount if he had indeed written it, and a presumably sputtering and red-faced Blount said that he could not recall and asked for some time to go through his papers and figure it out. Jefferson granted the request, and in the meantime, a Senate committee would investigate. July 7th, 1797, the House of Representatives formally impeaches William Blount. This doesn't remove him from the Senate. It just begins the process of investigation, at the end of which there'll be a trial in the Senate to determine his guilt. If he's convicted at that trial, then he'll be removed from office. So for now, William Blount is still a senator. July 8th, 1797, the Senate committee investigating the whole thing concludes their case by recommending the following resolution. Resolved that William Blount, Esquire, one of the senators of the United States, having been guilty of a high misdemeanor entirely inconsistent with his public trust and duty as a senator, be, and he hereby is, expelled from the Senate of the United States. The resolution passes by a whopping 25-1 vote. For the record, the lone vote supporting Blount came from Virginia's Henry Tazewell. And so, William Blount is officially expelled and the Tennessee seat is now vacant. This is a procedural issue that's worth dwelling on for just a moment. On July 7th, when Blount was impeached by the House, he was still a senator and would remain so until the trial in the Senate. But on July 8th, the Senate decided to expel him. That's how pissed off they were. This obviously immediately removed Blount, and he immediately went back home to Tennessee, but it also completely screwed up the impeachment, because it made the House investigation and the subsequent trial pointless. They still went through with the whole process, but unsurprisingly, Blount never came back to defend himself, because why would he? He wasn't getting his job back either way. And in the trial, the senators were divided as to whether they even had jurisdiction anymore since Blount was no longer a senator. Congress was also divided as to whether or not senators were even subject to impeachment in the first place. In the end, the trial in the Senate didn't take place until January of 1799, and when it did, Blount's lawyers defended him by arguing both points. On January 14th, 1799, the Senate voted 14-11 that the plea of the defendant is sufficient in law to show that this court ought not to hold jurisdiction of the said impeachment and that the said impeachment is dismissed. They didn't clarify which of the two defenses was correct. Maybe they meant both, who knows? But the point is that Blount was acquitted. If the Senate hadn't expelled him, then he would have kept his seat at that point. But they did expel him, and so, as of July 8, 1797, the Tennessee Senate seat is now vacant. July 10th, 1797, the first session comes to an end. The only thing worth mentioning here is that Philip Schuyler still hasn't made it to Philadelphia. But it's fine. He's not the first or last senator to miss an entire session, and I'm sure he'll be here when Congress reconvenes in the fall. It was kinda nice to start an episode with 0 brand new guys. We got a chance to get reacquainted with several returning characters. But change is a fact of life, and over the course of the 5th Congress there will be 13 changes. We already saw 1, and 3 more happened during the recess of 1797. First, on September 26th, the Tennessee legislature elected 2 new senators, one to replace William Blount, and the other to officially fill the seat that they left vacant before this Congress, which is currently being held by William Cock. Remember, Cock is just an interim appointment made by the governor. Cock's official time of service won't end until the new guy arrives and takes his seat, but for all intents and purposes, this is the end of Cock. No more Cock for anyone. The second and third changes were a pair of resignations in October. William Bradford of Rhode Island decided he didn't want to come back and just retired to private life in Bristol, which is fair. He was almost 68. He probably had a Lieutenant Murtaugh moment and said, "I'm too old for this shit." The other resignation was Vermont's Isaac Ticknor, who was elected governor of Vermont on October 17th. That's a valid reason. November 13th, 1797, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first day of the second session of the 5th United States Congress. Still not the constitutionally prescribed first Monday in December, but we're getting closer. In terms of first day attendees, New York's Philip Schuyler still isn't one of them, but I'm not too worried. I'm sure he'll be here soon. Besides, I can't be mad at him. He's just one of 23 senators not here on the first day. That's right. Only 9 senators are on time, which means no quorum! Kudos to these guys for showing up to work on time. November 21st, 1797, our first brand new guy arrives. They can't swear him in because without a quorum they can't do anything, but I can still introduce him. Ray Green of Rhode Island is a 32-year-old lawyer from Warwick. He spent the last 3 years as the state's attorney general before being specially elected to replace William Bradford. Green comes from a prominent Rhode Island family. His father had been governor for 8 years, his grandfather had been governor for 14 years, his great-grandfather had been deputy governor for 10 years, and his great-great-grandfather was one of the original settlers of Providence, Rhode Island, and a co-founder of the town of Warwick. By the way, at 32 years old, Ray Green is now the new youngest senator of the 5th Congress, replacing Richard Stockton. Get out of here, old man. November 22nd, 1797, we finally achieve a quorum with the arrival of 3 new senators. First up, we've got Joseph Anderson of Tennessee, who was specially elected to replace William Blount. Joseph Anderson, seen here looking more like Louis Anderson, ask your parents, kids, is a 40-year-old lawyer originally from Philadelphia. He moved to New Jersey during the war, he fought in the battles of Monmouth and Yorktown, and he spent the infamous winter at Valley Forge. After that, he moved to Delaware to set up his law practice and finally moved to what would eventually become Tennessee in 1791, when President Washington appointed him a United States judge for the Southwest Territory. Fun fact, his wife's name is Only Patience Outlaw. The next new arrival is another brand new guy, Nathaniel Chipman of Vermont, specially elected to replace Isaac Ticknor. Chipman is the 45-year-old Chief Justice of the Vermont Supreme Court. Like Joseph Anderson, Chipman fought in the war and also spent the winter at Valley Forge. He was originally from Salisbury, Connecticut, then moved to Vermont after the war to set up his law practice. And the third new arrival on November 22nd is not a brand new guy. It's the other new Tennessee senator, former Representative Andrew Jackson. He was specially elected to replace William Cock. So, we replaced a cock with a dick. Anyway, in lieu of a new fun fact for him, I have another mistake to own up to. In episode 4B, when I first introduced you to Jackson, I said he and his brother contracted malaria on the walk home after their mother had gotten them released from a British prison. This was incorrect. It was smallpox, and they had contracted it in the prison. Forgiveness, please. So now we've got a quorum and we can get down to business, right? Wrong, because you know who else is missing? Vice President Jefferson. But no worries, the president pro tempore will run things, and that person is, well, shit. To replace Bradford, they elected Jacob Reed of South Carolina. January 1st, 1798. As the new year begins, most of the senators have arrived for the second session, but one of the 6 missing senators, John Henry of Maryland, ain't coming back. Unbeknownst to the Senate, he has resigned. But he has a good reason. He was elected governor of Maryland. Also, another one of the missing senators, New York's Philip Schuyler, still hasn't arrived yet. Should we maybe send someone to check on him? I mean, he is 64 years old. No? Alright. I'm sure he'll be here soon. January 11th, 1798, James Lloyd of Maryland arrives to replace John Henry. Lloyd is a 41 or 42-year-old lawyer from Chestertown, and that's literally all I got for him. January 31st, 1798, the Senate receives news that Delaware Senator John Vining has resigned and that the legislature has elected his replacement. So that explains another one of the missing senators, but we're still missing these two guys. February 2nd, 1798, the senator from New York finally arrives, John Sloss Hobart. So what had happened was, back in January of last year, when Aaron Burr decided not to be a candidate for re-election, the New York legislature elected Philip Schuyler in a landslide. But Schuyler wasn't in the best of health, so he chose to stay home and recover instead of rushing straight to Philadelphia, which makes sense. But his health never improved, and in January of this year, he decided he wasn't going to make it. So he officially resigned his seat, and the New York legislature specially elected John Sloss Hobart instead. So, for the all-important numbers part of this series, it's important to note that this is not an official resignation. Schuyler never started his term, so he never had anything to resign from. What this was a senator-elect declining to serve. It's happened before, it'll happen again, it's not a resignation. So don't let anyone tell you that Philip Schuyler was a two-time senator. That's a goddamn lie. The timeline for this Senate seat goes Schuyler, then Burr, then vacant, and now Hobart from February 2nd, 1798 until, whenever. Speaking of Hobart, I should probably get back to doing my job. John Sloss Hobart is a 59-year-old lawyer and longtime state Supreme Court justice. He was originally from Fairfield, Connecticut, and moved to New York after college to set up his law practice. February 19th, 1798, Joshua Clayton of Delaware arrives to replace John Vining. Clayton is a 53-year-old physician and former governor of Delaware. He's also a son-in-law of former Senator Richard Bassett. Clayton spent the war as a surgeon on General Washington's staff, and like Joseph Anderson and Nathaniel Chipman, he also spent the winter at Valley Forge. April 12th, 1798, Andrew Jackson and James Lloyd both request and are granted leaves of absence for the remainder of the session. Neither of these are resignations, though. Yet. April 16th, 1798, the Senate receives a letter from New York's John Sloss Hobart resigning his seat. He has a solid reason, though. President Adams has appointed him to a federal judicial post in New York. Hobart's term of 2 months and 14 days is the shortest congressional term so far. May 21st, 1798, William North arrives from New York. He was appointed by Governor John Jay to replace John Sloss Hobart until the legislature convenes in the fall to elect a new senator. North served in the Revolutionary War as Baron von Steuben's aide-de-camp. He was even with Steuben at Yorktown when General Cornwallis surrendered. They were so close, in fact, that Steuben made North one of his heirs in his will, and later, North named 2 of his sons after Steuben. Looking at Steuben's full name, I'm surprised he stopped at 2. You could name 5 kids after this guy. July 2nd, 1798, John Rutherford of New Jersey finally joins the second session, 7.5 months late. That's a new record. July 16th, 1798, the end of the second session of Congress. But President Adams does need the Senate to stick around a few extra days for a special session. Nothing too crazy happens. Adams informs them that former President Washington has accepted his offer to be Commander-in-Chief of the Army. This is a mostly ceremonial gesture by Adams, as the quasi-war with France is entirely naval and no one believes it'll escalate into a land battle in any way, but it's a quick, easy way for Adams to score some political points. The rest of the special session is Adams sending the Senate a list of nominations for various high-ranking military posts and then the Senate approving them. Except this guy. I don't know what he did to piss them off, but he was the only one rejected. Maybe James Gunn had a grudge against him too. And lastly, on the final day, Adams nominates Senator William North of New York to be Adjutant General, and the Senate approves. North is just an interim senator anyway, and the New York legislature will have elected his replacement before the next session, so this works out great for everyone. December 3rd, 1798, Independence Hall, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the first day of the third session of the 5th United States Congress. And guess what? It's actually the first Monday in December. So that's good. What's not good is the first day attendance. Once again, only 9 of our 32 senators are here on time, which means, well, you know the drill by now. By the way, 3 of these guys have been on time to every session so far, and they were at the special session, so kudos to these 3 guys. And hey, Also in attendance on this first day is another brand new guy. Remember when Andrew Jackson left the last session early? Well, not long after he got home, Governor John Sevier appointed him to a seat on the Tennessee Superior Court, so Jackson resigned his seat in the Senate. With the state legislature out of session, this meant that Sevier got to appoint Jackson's replacement. And so, Daniel Smith was appointed in October and made it here on time. Good first impression. Smith is a 50-year-old surveyor who had also been Secretary of the Southwest Territory. During his time as surveyor for Sumner County, he laid out the town of Nashville. And no, he's not related to Nathaniel, William, Samuel, Jeremiah, William, a different one, Isaac, Israel, or William L. Smith. Jokes aside though, he is actually the first Smith in the Senate. December 6th, 1798. After just a short 3-day wait, enough senators have arrived that we finally have a quorum and we can finally get to work. Also, 4 senators are not going to be coming back. There's William North of New York, but we already knew about him. In Delaware, Joshua Clayton died back on August 11th, and John Rutherford of New Jersey and John Hunter of South Carolina resigned and retired to private life. December 11th, 1798, James Watson of New York arrives. He had been specially elected to replace William North, who had been appointed to replace John Sloss Hobart, who had been specially elected to fill the vacancy created by the lack of Philip Schuyler. Watson is a 48-year-old merchant and state senator originally from Woodbury, Connecticut. He fought in the war and then moved to New York City in 1786. Fun fact, his house in New York City still stands today. On its own, that's not all that shocking. Lots of these guys' houses are still standing today, but most of those are out in the country somewhere. His home was right in the middle of Manhattan, and it's especially surprising that it's still there because it was only just added to the National Register of Historic Places in 1972. December 19th, 1798, Franklin Davenport of New Jersey arrives. He was appointed by Governor Richard Howell to temporarily replace John Rutherford. Davenport is actually already a representative-elect for the next Congress. New Jersey's elections for the House were held in October, and Davenport defeated former Senator Jonathan Elmer. So, one of two things will happen the next time the legislature convenes. Either they will elect a new senator and Davenport's term in the Senate will end March 3rd and his term in the House will start March 4th, but all that's a future problem. January 21st, 1799, Henry Tazewell of Virginia finally joins the third session, only a month and a half late. But oh well, better late than never, right? January 24th, 1799, Henry Tazewell of Virginia dies. Oh. The Virginia legislature was already out of session, but for whatever reason, Virginia Governor James Wood didn't bother appointing a temporary replacement, so this seat will stay vacant until sometime during the next Congress. February 4th, 1799, William H. Wells of Delaware arrives, specially elected to replace the deceased Joshua Clayton. Wait a second. Are we sure he's not just a flipped version of Franklin Davenport? Wells is a 30-year-old lawyer and state representative. He is also the new youngest senator, taking the title from Andrew Jackson, or more accurately from Ray Green, since Jackson is already gone. Whatever. Get out of here, old man. Wells is barely old enough, having just reached the constitutionally mandated age of 30 less than a month ago. February 16th, 1799, last but not least, Charles Pinckney of South Carolina arrives, specially elected to replace John Hunter. Pinckney is the 41-year-old governor of South Carolina, and he is often confused with his cousin Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. Both were members of the Continental Congress, both men served as delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and both men are the namesake of Pinckney Street in Madison, Wisconsin. They went in different directions from there, though. This Charles Pinckney stayed in the world of South Carolina politics and put together the impressive resume seen here, while Charles Cotesworth Pinckney embarked on a brief diplomatic career that led to 2 failed runs for president in 1804 and 1808. Here's a bad joke to help you remember which one's which. In the 1804 and 1808 presidential elections, voters must have looked at the candidates and gone, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney? More like Charles Nopesworth Pinckney, am I right? You know what? No, I will not apologize for that, and you know why? Because someday down the road, you're gonna see the name Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, and you're gonna think to yourself, Nopesworth, and you're gonna chuckle remembering that shitty joke. So I'm not gonna apologize. You're welcome. And that brings us to March 3rd, 1799, the end of the 5th United States Congress. We made it through another one. But before we get to the election cycle and the goodbye forever section, let's update some numbers. The 5th Senate had 32 seats held by 44 senators, 13 of whom were new to the Senate. One of those was Andrew Jackson, who we already met in the House, which means 12 of them were brand new guys, and that means we've now met 83 senators and 270 congressmen overall. As for changes in membership, we had 13. Normally I call this part deaths and resignations, but the Senate had 4 different varieties of changes. Besides the deaths and resignations, there were also 2 cases of a senator leaving because they were temporary appointments and their duly elected replacement arrived, and there was the 1 expulsion. For deaths, the 5th Senate had 2, which brings our Senate total up to 4, and our Congress total up to 7. In the resignations department, we had 8. Remember, Philip Schuyler doesn't count because he never started his term in the first place. This brings our Senate total up to 25, and our Congress total up to 39. And yes, that's just a picture of a list. I am not spending an hour making a graphic with 39 pictures in it just for a 3-second visual. Okay, so time to figure out who's leaving this series forever. 21 of our 32 seats were not up for re-election in this cycle, so we'll see these 21 guys again right away in the next episode. This means 11 seats were up for re-election, but one of them was the Virginia seat that Henry Tazewell had occupied, and he did not run for re-election due to the notable handicap of being dead. So 10 actual senators were up for re-election. Of those, 5 were re-elected. So that leaves us with 18 senators going away. The 5 that were not re-elected, and the 13 that left during the 5th Congress. But not all of them are going away forever. Theodore Sedgwick of Massachusetts chose not to be a candidate for re-election because he chose to run for the House instead, which is unusual. Only 2 senators before him have gone to the House after the Senate, but neither of them chose the House over the Senate. Wingate had already lost re-election to the Senate, and Gallatin had been forced out of the Senate the year before. But Sedgwick had been a representative for 7 years before being specially elected to this seat, and he must have just liked being in the House better. So, good for him. And it was the right choice, too. He ended up winning that election in a landslide. So he'll be back soon. Richard Stockton of New Jersey was not a candidate for re-election, but he will return to the series when he gets elected to the House in 1813. Isaac Ticknor of Vermont resigned during this Congress to become governor, but he'll be back when he joins the Senate again in 1815. Tennessee is, to put it bluntly, all fucked up. So in the Class 1 seat, we had William Koch, who had been temporarily appointed to fill the vacancy left by William Koch, then Andrew Jackson, who had been elected to replace the interim Koch, and then Daniel Smith, who had been appointed to replace Jackson after he resigned. In the Class 2 seat, we had William Blount, and then Joseph Anderson, who had been elected to replace Blount after his expulsion. Still with me? Okay, good. So, the Class 2 seat was the one up for re-election in this cycle. So when the Tennessee legislature convened back in December, they had to elect a new senator for the Class 2 seat, meaning a new 6-year term, and then specially elect a new senator for the Class 1 seat, which still had 4 years left on that term. Okay, now, they re-elected Joseph Anderson, but they elected him to the Class 1 seat, replacing Smith. So instead of giving him a new 6-year Class 2 term, they gave him the 4 remaining years of the Class 1 term. Their dials were clearly set to maximum chaos, because after that, who did they elect to replace Anderson in the Class 2 seat? William Koch. So all this is to say that William Koch and Joseph Anderson will be back right away in the next episode. Meanwhile, Andrew Jackson will return to the Senate eventually in 1823, and Daniel Smith will return to the Senate in 1805. And that just leaves William Blount. For him, and for 11 others, it's goodbye forever. William Blount of Tennessee was expelled on July 8, 1797, and went straight home to Tennessee. He never came back to defend himself in his impeachment trial, because why would he? He was already expelled anyway. Blount's national reputation may have been damaged by the conspiracy charges, but back home in Tennessee, he was more popular than ever. He was elected to the state senate right away in 1798, and served in that legislature until his death in Knoxville at the age of 50 on March 21st, 1800. Several things are named after William Blount, including a county, a town, and a high school in Tennessee, plus a street in Madison, Wisconsin. As for congressional relatives, his brother Thomas Blount is a representative from North Carolina, and his son William Granger Blount will become a representative from Tennessee. Joshua Clayton of Delaware died on August 11, 1798 at the age of 54 in Newcastle County. His son Thomas Clayton will become a representative and senator, and his nephew John Clayton will become a senator. In fact, Thomas Clayton will join the Senate to replace his cousin John Clayton after the latter's resignation. Henry Tazewell of Virginia died on January 24, 1799 at the age of 45, just 3 days after arriving in Philadelphia to join the third session. His son, Littleton Waller Tazewell, became a representative and senator. John Vining of Delaware resigned in January of 1798 and retired to private life in Dover, where he and his wife Anna enjoyed lavishly entertaining guests. That is, until Anna died unexpectedly in 1800. Vining, unable to cope with the stress of raising 4 young sons, became an alcoholic and essentially drank away his entire fortune. He died just 2 years after Anna in February of 1802 at the age of 43. Josiah Tatnall of Georgia was not a candidate for re-election. He returned home to Georgia, then served 1 term as governor. After that, he retired to private life, but it wasn't a long retirement. He died on June 6, 1803 in Nassau, in what was then the British West Indies, but is now the Bahamas. Given his age at the time, just 40 or 41, I assume he had become sick and was making the trip in hopes of improving his health, which was the style at the time. And just like almost every other such trip, it didn't work. John Hunter of South Carolina resigned between the second and third sessions and retired to his plantation. He died at the age of 50 on December 30th, 1802. John Henry of Maryland resigned in December of 1797 after being elected governor. He served a single term but did not run for re-election due to poor health, and he was right not to do so. He died soon after leaving office on December 16th, 1798 at his home in Dorchester County. He was just 48 years old. Man, everyone's dying young around here. John Rutherford of New Jersey resigned during the recess between the second and third sessions. He retired to private life, but he, at least, lived for a while after doing so. He didn't die until February 23, 1840 in Bergen County, New Jersey. He made it to the age of 79. John Sloss Hobart of New York resigned after just a couple months in the Senate when President Adams appointed him to a judicial post for the District Court in New York. He stayed at that post until he died on February 4, 1805, at the age of 66. William North of New York was just a temporary appointment who was replaced by the duly elected James Watson at the beginning of the third session. President Adams had made North an adjutant general in the newly raised army. Remember, there was no standing army back then. They were raising an army just in case the quasi-war with France escalated. This appointment lasted a couple years before the France stuff cooled down and the army was no longer necessary. But during his time on the job, he worked as Alexander Hamilton's chief of staff. Later, he did one last term in the New York State Senate and then retired to private life. He eventually died at the age of 80 on January 3, 1836 in New York City. Alexander Martin of North Carolina lost his election, the only incumbent senator this time around to do so. He returned to North Carolina, where he did one more term in the state Senate. He died at the age of 67 on November 2, 1807 in Rockingham County. William Bradford of Rhode Island resigned between the first and second sessions and retired to private life in Bristol, where he eventually died at the age of 78 on July 6, 1808. His great-great-grandson, LeBaron Bradford Colt, became a senator from Rhode Island. And a bonus goodbye forever, Philip Schuyler of New York. Schuyler never joined this Congress, but back at the end of the first episode, I didn't give him a proper goodbye because it looked like he was gonna be back. So, I'll do it here. After he left Congress back in 1791, he returned to the New York State Senate until his election to this Senate. As we discussed, he ultimately declined his seat due to poor health, but he did hang on for a few more years, finally dying at the age of 70 on November 18, 1804. He had a bunch of kids, some of whom you probably already know about, and several of them married into prominent political families, but surprisingly, he only has one congressional descendant. His son, Philip Jeremiah Schuyler, became a one-term representative from New York. Now, before I go, I just want to tell you this one last thing about Schuyler's great-great-grandson, Robert Ray Hamilton. He never became a congressman, but his entry on the Political Graveyard website is so batshit insane, I just have to share it with you. In July 1889, while staying in Atlantic City, he was caught in a national scandal after his wife, Eva, stabbed a nurse. She was arrested and tried. It came out that Eva was still married to another man, that she had bought a baby for $10 and told Hamilton he was the father to induce him to marry her. When this was publicized, Hamilton sued for divorce. As the case dragged on, he moved to Wyoming to help a friend establish a hotel. While on a hunting trip, he drowned while attempting to ford the Snake River. And that was the 5th Senate. If you made it through this whole video, I cannot even begin to tell you how much I appreciate you. I have been the Congressman, and I will see you next time.